Oh, good morning, protege. Of course, good afternoon to my wonderful eighth period class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my direct instruction for we are on Monday, and it's November 8th, 2021. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill. So at this point, I'm going to share my screen with everybody. And again, you guys know the drill. You're going to need a blue or black pen. You're going to need multiple colored highlighters, correctable tape. And again, I would real strongly, respectfully request that during the Zoomcast, don't be highlighting and cleaning up because it's taking away from your opportunity to really be focused, engaged, listening, and focusing, of course, on your copious note-taking. You can always go back and finish up the cleaning up and highlighting once you're done with the entire Zoomcast. All right. So go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. You've already dated your notes for today. It's November 8th, 2021. And I want you to write down for me Herbert Hoover response. All right. Now, before we talk about Herbert Hoover and the election of 1928, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to go back to the previous set of direct instructional notes. And I want to go back and finish up the banking system. So go back to the previous Zoomcast notes, okay? Remember, the failure of the banking system was the last of your major factors of the Great Depression. Again, we talk about things like the stock market crash. That's your biggest one. We learned about people who are not saving money the way they used to, overproduction, underconsumption. You add the two together, it leads to higher unemployment. And don't forget speculation. People are engaging in risky business ventures to make money, like looking at the idea of buying on margin. And then finally, of course, the failure of the banking system and how the banking system was so strongly intertwined and connected with the stock market. They were mutually inclusive. All right, now I want you to write this down, and then we'll get back to Herbert Hoover. So what I always do when I talk about the failure of the banking system, I think it's really important that I need to share some statistics with you. So I'm going to be channeling my inner Mr. Rosenak here because, you know, we all love math teachers because they really count. So this is what Mr. Bonk calls by the numbers. I want you to write this down. Now, I'm not going to ask you a specific statistic on the assessment, but on the other hand, I might use these statistics as context clues. It gives you a greater understanding. All right, number one. So first of all, if you go back between the years 1931 and 1932, now remember, it was at this point that the stock market had hit rock bottom, not 1929 Rocktober, when you talk about Black Thursday and Black Tuesday. Remember, the market actually rebounded for a little bit, but it was really 1931, really into 1932, that's when the stock market really hit rock bottom. Remember that graph we analyzed? Well, I don't think it's coincidence that there's now a connection between how the stock market had hit rock bottom and between 1931 and 1932, 3,800 banks had failed throughout the United States. That means they closed their doors. Now, why is that important? You should draw a line, add this as an oral note. We're going to do a lot more oral note taking. Anybody who had money in a bank, anybody who had money in a bank at this time, you just lost everything. It's all gone. I don't care if it's $100. I don't care if it's $1,000. It has all disappeared. Because again, too frequently people were scared and they were making bank runs and everybody was throwing their money. And remember, the banks, they don't keep a lot of money necessarily at the facility because they're taking that money and they're investing in their bank by giving out loans. And a lot of times they were providing loans for people who were buying stocks on margin. So that's the connection between the banking system and the stock market. Number two, by 1933, by the time Franklin Roosevelt will become our 32nd president in March, 20% of all banks throughout the United States will have closed its doors. That's 2 out of 10, 20 out of 100, 200 out of 1,000. So again, any person, I don't care if it's an adult or a kid, anybody who has money in a bank at this point, there's a good chance you've just lost your life savings, even if you never once was involved with the stock market. And if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, remember that photograph of the American Union Bank? What are all these people doing? This is what we call a bank run. And they are all running to the American Union Bank, attempting to withdraw all their money. Eventually, the bank is going to close its doors. And if it closes its doors, it's not going to reopen again. And that means if you had money in the American Union Bank, you just lost your life savings. And by 1932, 1933, photographs like this become way, way too commonplace. So I want you to do me a favor. Stop the Zoomcast, draw a line off to the side. Take 2 to 3 minutes. I want you to vividly describe this photograph for me in detail. And number 2, as you're describing it, how is this photograph going to represent and foreshadow the Great Depression as compared to, say, a photograph from the Roaring '20s, say, of flappers? So again, stop the Zoomcast, 2 to 3 minutes, write your reflection. Again, I'll be circulating around the room, making sure you're doing this. And again, it's really important to understand how so different these 2 decades really were when you go from the Roaring '20s now to the 1930s and the Great Depression. I'm going to continue on. All right, now here's what I want you to do. Go back to that new set of notes. Remember, you set this up at the beginning. Let's get into it. Please write this down. All right, 1928, we're going to go back in time. Remember, I had early covered all the warning signs of the stock market crash. Like, again, housing industry had suffered serious losses over $1 billion. I talked about the factors of the Great Depression, things like the stock market crash and the failure of the banking system and speculation and overproduction and underconsumption, et cetera. But now we're going to jump back in time to 1928. So 1928, nobody had that crystal ball to foresee that we have a huge economic crisis looming in the horizon. There were 2 unique features of the election in 1928. Number 1, will he or won't he? Now remember, Calvin Coolidge was only elected for 1 term, and that was in 1924. He took over for Warren G. Harding when Harding died unexpectedly in August of 1923. So if Mr. Coolidge chose to run again, he could have. And he would not have been breaking the precedents of George Washington, because even though he took over for part of a term, he was, again, only president for about 5 years. He still had a couple more years to go. And yet, in Calvin Coolidge fashion, he chooses not to run again. And if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, of course, that's a photograph of Calvin Coolidge. And what's fascinating is, again, remember I used the word laconic, a person of a few words? You know, when he announced he wasn't going to run again, this is what he did. He wrote this on a napkin, write it down. He just wrote down, I do not choose to run for president in 1928, Calvin Coolidge. That's it. No fanfare, no fuss. Now, there's a lot of speculation, no pun intended, why he didn't run again. Is it possible that Calvin Coolidge foresaw the storm clouds that were brewing with the Great Depression coming? Remember, the whole story I told you about, again, people were engaging in speculation. The Treasury Department warned him and said, you've got to curb this. And remember, he went to the White House basement to count apples from a friend of his in New Hampshire. That was more important than it was for him to go and try to tackle this potential problem down the road. Number 2. So here's the other big issue. So we're going to have a brand new president in 1928. And whoever wins this election, they are going to come into us thinking that this is going to be a continuation of the Roaring '20s. Remember how Dr. Brands talked about there was this notion that the good times were going to continue on forever. No, they're not. It's going to come to a screeching, crashing halt. So we've had depressions before. We had the Panic of 1837 when Martin Van Buren was president. There was a depression in 1873 when Ulysses S. Grant was the 18th president. We had a depression in 1894 when Grover Cleveland was president of the United States of America, the 24th. But we never experienced a Great Depression like this one. And if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen to my laptop, again, these guys are holding up signs. It says it all. That's what everybody was looking for in 1932, or again, 1933. But it really goes back to 1929. All right, but we're going back to 1928. So please write this down. So in the election in 1928, there were two candidates running for the presidency, and one of which is not Calvin Coolidge. And again, whoever wins this election has no clue that they're going to be blamed for the Great Depression. And I've always maintained that it's fair game to blame whoever wins this election, but not completely. I still feel strongly that if you're going to point a finger at the person who's going to win this election, you better point another finger at Calvin Coolidge, because I do think he shares some responsibility. He was warned, again, about rampant speculation going on in the United States. He chose not to do anything. All right, number one. So one of the candidates running for the presidency in 1928 was a gentleman by the name of Alfred E. Smith. If you direct your attention to my laptop, that, of course, is Al Smith, as we call him. Al Smith represented the Democratic Party. The Democrats have not been in the White House since Woodrow Wilson walked away in 1921. He's from the great state of New York. He was given the nickname the Happy Warrior. Why? Well, you notice, number one, always had a smile on his face. You might want to clarify this for an oral note or with an oral note. And number two, he was called a warrior, not because he was necessarily willing to fight with his fist, but use his voice to speak up for the common Joe. Now, what would he have campaigned on? His political experience. Number one, he was a four-term progressive governor from the great state of New York. Future or other governors in New York include Theodore Roosevelt. He was a former governor of New York. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, future president, was also a governor of New York. So progressive, thinking outside the box. Now, number two, Al Smith in 1928 campaigned on he's a wet. So what does that mean? Draw a line off this side. You definitely want to add an oral note. Wet means he opposed prohibition. He felt that prohibition was a great idea. It's a social experiment of the progressive era that just has proven to be a total failure. And he's basically saying, if I'm elected president, I will do what's necessary to repeal the 18th Amendment. Now, here's where the story gets a little complicated. Al Smith is a Roman Catholic. And this is going to be a big topic of discussion amongst the American people in 1928. So why would that be a big topic? All right. So if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, this is the spiritual leader of the Roman Catholic Church, and that's the Pope. That's Pope Francis. Now, why would this be a big deal that Al Smith is running as a Catholic? Well, you have to understand that in 1928, the vast majority of the United States of America embraced the teachings of Christianity. And again, not in getting into a long theological discussion, but Christianity experienced what's called a split, a partition. It was through what's called the Protestant Reformation. So what happens is you now have two different groups. You have Protestants who are people who embrace the teachings of Christianity, but they don't recognize the Pope as their spiritual leader. Then you have the Roman Catholics like Al Smith. I was raised Roman Catholic. And again, as a Roman Catholic, you still embrace the teachings of Christianity, but the difference is you recognize the Pope as your spiritual leader. Protestants don't. And so why would this be a concern in 1928? You should draw a line off to the side, because there were people, and the vast majority of the country was Protestant. They didn't recognize the Pope as their leader, their spiritual leader. So a lot of people were worried, if you elect a Roman Catholic as president, would his loyalty be to the United States and the Constitution, or would his loyalty be to the Pope? So basically, from George Washington through Calvin Coolidge, so from your first president all the way through your 30th president, all 30 of those presidents were Protestants. Not one of those presidents was Catholic. There were no Jewish presidents. There were no Hindu presidents. There were no Sikh presidents. There were no Muslim presidents. It was a very consistent trend that developed. But getting back to Al Smith, is America ready to vote and elect, I should say, a Roman Catholic president? As we're going to find out, the answer is no. The first Roman Catholic president won't be until another 32 years in the future, and that will be John F. Kennedy. All right, let's talk about the other candidate running for the presidency. And that, of course, is Herbert Hoover. And you direct your attention up to my laptop screen. That's, of course, Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover, of course, is from the Republican Party, hoping to continue on what was started by Warren G. Harding, and then, of course, continuing on with his successor, I should say, Calvin Coolidge, and his vice president. All right. So Herbert Hoover, why would you want to vote for him? Let's look at his political experience. Number one, we're going to actually come back to this after Thanksgiving break. So during World War I, Herbert Hoover did a phenomenal job as the food administrator of the Food Administration, 1917, 1918. Those were the years that the United States actually participated in World War I. Number two, he was, of course, Secretary of Commerce. You knew that from 1921 through 1928. Commerce is trade. You should add a side note to that. And number three, he was a dry. So what does a dry mean? So draw a line off to the side. You're going to add an oral note. So Al Smith was a wet. That means he opposed prohibition. He said he'd repeal it. Herbert Hoover was a dry. And he basically said he would support and continue to enforce the Volstead Act and the 18th Amendment, which, of course, is the prohibition of alcohol. All right. So when the votes were counted, so this election really comes down to a couple of things. Number one, do we want to go back to the progressive ways? Because Al Smith would be a progressive president. That's one. Two, I think this election was, again, do we continue with the Republican fiscal policy of Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and now Herbert Hoover, or do we go back to the progressives of Woodrow Wilson, William Howard Taft, Theodore Roosevelt? But here's your other big decision. When you look at the United States in 1928, there was a noticeable divide. A big still segment of the country would be people living in the rural countryside, mostly Protestants. On the other hand, you do have more people moving to the big cities like New York and my hometown of Chicago, and many of them embrace Catholicism. So in some ways, religion does play a big role in determining who's going to win this election. Besides, again, which fiscal policy are we going to go with? Are we going to go with the one that's been carried on through Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge? Or are we going to have a fiscal policy more similar to Woodrow Wilson, who raised taxes and in turn raised spending? So here we go. Herbert Hoover, 404 electoral votes. Al Smith, 87 electoral votes. This is what we call, kids, a landslide when one candidate thoroughly defeats another. So that means that our new president of the United States of America is Herbert Clark Hoover. All right, skip a full page. I want you guys to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. We're going to come back to those notes. Don't worry. Date your notes again for today. It is November 8th, 2021. Write down for me guide questions. Herbert Hoover is elected 1928. So once again, I was able to find a really cool video clip with actual archival footage of Herbert Hoover being sworn in as our nation's 31st president. So let me give you some guide questions. I'm going to go through these quickly because I know you guys can pause with each question and write it down. Pardon me. Number one, here we go. First guide question. So who actually swore in Herbert Hoover as president of the United States of America in 1929, March? We now swear in all presidents in January, around January 20th. Skip a line or two. Number two, what was Herbert Hoover's goal or platform for the next 4 years? So platform is basically, this is what I'm running on. This is what I want to do. This is what I hope to achieve. So economically speaking, what is he basically telling the American people? This is what he wants to get done from 1929 through early 1933. Number three, what was Herbert Hoover's slogan? You know, kind of a catchphrase. Mine has always been think history. What was his as he's running for the presidency in 1928? Number four, why was Herbert Hoover considered a Horatio Alger story? I'm actually going to talk more about this in my direct instruction once we complete the video clip. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. I love these Pathé newsreels, milestones of the century. About 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Here we go. Herbert Hoover's elected.
Of the century. On March 4th, 1929, Herbert Hoover left his private mansion to become the 31st President of the United States. Mrs. Hoover smiled happily as she prepared to become the First Lady of the land. At the White House, President Coolidge, the man who did not choose to run, performed his last official duty. He joins the inaugural parade, escorting Herbert Hoover to the steps of the Supreme Court for the inauguration. The First Ladies were happily setting the fashion of the day. It was a dull gray day as the two Republican leaders, smiling happily, began the last of their journey. Newsmen recorded the event of the man who had promised prosperity for everyone. Troops of cavalry in full dress headed the parade, adding pomp and ceremony to the occasion. Thousands lined the avenue to view the man they had selected by popular vote. This was a Horatio Alger story, the story of an orphan from a small town who had worked his way to the presidency. Now, on the steps of the Supreme Court, Herbert Hoover waited for Chief Justice William Howard Taft to administer the oath of office. Spectators strained to hear the words, for only 30 times in 150 years of American history have they ever been spoken. Herbert Hoover, now President of the United States, stood before the people. His platform had been prosperity for everyone. There is no guarantee against poverty equal to a job for everyone, he said. One of the oldest of human aspirations has been the abolition of poverty. America is near to that triumph. With the election of Herbert Hoover, the country had a new slogan: 4 more years of prosperity. Victory March to the White House was joined by thousands from all over the country. Those who could not witness the ceremony waited patiently along Pennsylvania Avenue. Cavalry and military bands triumphantly escorted Herbert Hoover as he greeted the waiting people for the first time as president. Even the rain failed to mar the occasion, as gaily colored umbrellas marched up the avenue to the strains of marching music. As the new commander-in-chief, the president reviewed the strength of America. Herbert Hoover, the man who traveled the road of glory from an orphanage to the White House, had achieved his milestone of the century.
So a couple of takeaways. Number one, in one of the great ironies of history, when Herbert Hoover spoke of in 1929 that America was on the brink of basically abolishing, and I'm paraphrasing him now, abolishing or eliminating poverty, boy, was he sadly wrong. In actuality, we're going to be ushering it in on a scale never witnessed before in American history. Observation number two, I think it's so cool the fact the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, as a rule of thumb, with the exception of Calvin Coolidge, swears in the President of the United States of America. And how cool is it the fact that William Howard Taft, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and former President of the United States of America, number 27, swore in Herbert Clark Hoover as president. How cool is that? All right, go back to the previous page. Let's continue on. So here's what I want to do. I want to share with you guys some interesting facts about Herbert Hoover, just like I did with Calvin Coolidge, just like I did with, of course, Warren G. Harding. I'm going to get into his accomplishments today. Won't finish all of them, but I want to give you a better perspective of who Herbert Hoover was. He was truly a remarkable individual. One of the greatest ironies of Herbert Hoover was everything he did in life, he was a total success story, except for one thing, and that's being president of the United States of America. All right, here we go. We're going to skip over this. Let's do this one. Yes, please write this down. I like this one. So they mentioned this in the video clip, that Herbert Hoover might be the best example of what we call in history a Horatio Alger story. Now, they don't really explain what that means, and that's my job to fill in the blanks. So if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this is a book that you would have seen back in the 19th century. The author was Horatio Alger Jr., and this particular book was called Facing the World. Horatio Alger's stories were very popular in the 19th century, and the theme of all of his books, all of them, were what we call rags to riches. So he would profile some kid who was born really, really poor, and through hard work, determination, intelligence, being a good person, and sometimes just being lucky, like Andrew Carnegie being able to come under the mentorship of Thomas A. Scott with the Pennsylvania Railroad. But that really describes to me Herbert Hoover. He was a rags to riches story. He's a remarkable story when you study his life. He just wasn't a very good president. So here we go. Number one. So at the age of 9, so think about that. So you're 9 years old. You're what, 4th grade at that point? So at the age of 9, he was orphaned. His mom and his dad had died. So at this point, the question is, who's going to take care of this 9-year-old kid? So Herbert Hoover was born and raised initially in Iowa. But at the age of 9, since his parents were both deceased, he's going to get on a train by himself and goes all the way across country from Iowa all the way to Oregon to live with relatives, an aunt and an uncle that he probably never even met before. So how much of a culture shock that must have been for him. Now he's being raised by people that are not his parents. Yes, they're relatives, but they're still not mom and dad. And now going from Iowa to Oregon, very, very different. So very, very poor. Again, tough beginning. Yet number 2, one good thing that came out of this is Herbert Hoover's uncle insisted on education. So Herbert Hoover was part of the very first class, the inaugural class, to attend a very prominent university. It was named after a famous politician. He was a senator from California, Leland Stanford. We, of course, know it as Stanford University, located in the southeast part of San Francisco Bay in beautiful Palo Alto, California. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop, this is a photograph, an aerial shot of Stanford, which, by the way, is consistently ranked in the top 10 finest universities in the United States of America. So Herbert Hoover is going to be going to a really, really good school. Let's continue on. Now, in addition, he's also part of the very first class to graduate from Stanford University. He graduates in 1895 with a degree in geology, which you're studying right now in science class. So geology, the study of rocks, sedimentary rocks, the Earth's crust, magma, all of this. So he, by the way, you should make a little oral note. He is the only American president who graduated with a degree in geology. How cool is that? All right. Oh, and one other thing about Herbert Hoover. If you direct your attention up to my, again, screen, Herbert Hoover also played baseball at Stanford University. So can you figure out which of these young men was Herbert Hoover? And the answer is, are you ready? Drum roll, please. Right there. That's a very young Herbert Hoover as part of the Stanford Cardinals baseball team. And if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, so that's a shot of Herbert Hoover much later in life, and that's Herbert Hoover as a young man. Let's continue on. Now, there's a really cool story about Herbert Hoover as a young man playing for Stanford University for the Cardinals baseball team. And it's what I like to call past meets present. So, of course, here's Herbert Hoover right here. So Herbert Hoover also at that time was responsible for collecting tickets. So he was collecting tickets for the Stanford Cardinal baseball game. So this gentleman shows up. I won't mention his name yet. He loved baseball though. So the story is this gentleman gets a little confused. Herbert Hoover stops this guy and says, "Excuse me, sir, you can't sneak in the game. You have to have a ticket." And this gentleman, very distinguished looking man, goes, "Well, I'm sorry, young man. I must have been confused. How much do I owe you?" And Herbert Hoover said, "It costs $0.25 to get in." Good luck spending a quarter on watching the Chicago Cubs play or the Chicago White Sox. So at this point, a young Herbert Hoover looks at this elderly gentleman and goes, "Sir, you look very familiar to me. Do I know you?" And at this point, this gentleman looks at young Herbert Hoover and says, "Well, maybe you do. I'm the former president of the United States of America. My name is Benjamin Harrison." So Benjamin Harrison was the 23rd president of the United States of America from 1889 to 1893. So by the time he stepped down as president, he had retired from politics and just was traveling around the country, giving speeches, wanted to take in a baseball game because, by the way, Benjamin Harrison is the first American president to actually attend a Major League Baseball game. So a little trivia with that one. So here you go. You have a former past president, Benjamin Harrison, meeting a future president in Herbert Hoover. But I got another one for you. How about this one? Do you recognize any of these two individuals in this photograph shaking hands? Here's what I want you to do. Stop the Zoomcast. Take 20 seconds. Can you identify this gentleman? And can you identify this young, good-looking man? You ready? So this gentleman right here is the president of the United States at the time. His name is John F. Kennedy. This good-looking young man right here, his name is future President William Jefferson Clinton. We, of course, know him as Bill Clinton. So this is a little different. So when Benjamin Harrison met Herbert Hoover, that was an example of, again, a past president meeting a future president. In this famous photograph, you have a present president, a little alliteration there, meeting a future president in Bill Clinton. I thought if you would direct your attention to the overhead screen, that's a great photograph of Bill Clinton, future president of the United States of America. I thought it would be kind of fun to watch this video clip. You don't have to take notes on it, put your pens down, and this kind of ties it all together. What happens when the present meets the future.
It was a beautiful, bright summer day. It was July 24, 1963. And we were all assembled in the Rose Garden at the White House as a group, waiting for the president to come out. We all sat there, riveted in attention.
We want to welcome you to the White House, particularly because this belongs to all of you and because it's so intimately connected with the best in American history.
I was about the third or fourth person in. And he started here, and I sort of muscled my way up and made sure I got to shake hands with the president. I think he was quite generous. He went down the line and shook hands with a pretty good number of us who were there. It had a very profound impact on me. I think that, it's something that I carried with me always. And I was very fortunate that someone took a picture of it and gave it to me. So I was always able to remember it.
Right after that frame, the famous frame of him shaking hands with JFK, there's another picture from the same film showing President Kennedy shaking hands with Jeff Keyes, another one of our boys, him from Florida, and Bill Clinton looking down at his hand with this wonderful look like I'll never wash it again.
By the way, I had the opportunity myself, yours truly, Mr. Bonk, I had a chance to meet a former president. Many years ago, he was speaking at the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs. His name was James E. Carter. We, of course, know him as Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter was president of the United States from 1977 to 1981. So he was president of the United States during my high school years, and then in the very beginning of my career in college. So I had a chance to meet Jimmy Carter, and it was just, to me, the experience of my lifetime to meet the president of the United States when I was your age or a little older at that point. Took a picture with former President Jimmy Carter, and I can certainly appreciate how Bill Clinton must have felt so awestruck and starstruck. I mean, meeting and shaking the hands with the President of the United States of America. How cool is that? All right, let's continue on. Oh, I'd like you to write this down. A couple more interesting facts, and then we'll get into some accomplishments. All right, Herbert Hoover was one of the wealthiest of American presidents in American history. Again, absolutely ties in with this rags to riches story, this Horatio Alger story. So in 1895, He graduates with a degree in geology from Stanford University. Now, what are you going to do? So when he graduated in 1895, he's 18 years or 21 years old, I should say at this point, he had $40 to his name. So what's going to happen is, as again, Herbert Hoover makes his way to the world, he's going to join this mining corporation called the Bewick Mooring and Company. He's going to travel around the world. He's going to spend time living in China for a period of time. And he actually had recommended to the Bewick Mooring and Company to invest in a gold mine. It's called the Sons of Gwalia in Australia. They bought the mine, discovered gold, made a lot of money. And as a result, again, future President Herbert Hoover was compensated quite nicely. So by 1914, Herbert Hoover is going to retire at a relatively young age. And in 1914, Herbert Hoover was estimated to be worth anywhere from $4 to $5 million. So here's a guy that went to having $40 in his pocket to a guy by the time he's 40 years old worth over $5 million. And that's the currency of the day. Today, that's probably worth over $100 million. Truly remarkable. One other interesting fact, and then we'll move on to his accomplishments. By the way, Herbert Hoover met his future wife, Lou Henry, at Stanford. How many women went to college in those days, ladies? Answer, almost nobody. Pretty remarkable. Now remember, because again, Herbert Hoover worked for the Bewick Mooring and Company, a mining company based out of London, England, he traveled a lot from the time he was 21 till the time he was 40. And he spent a significant period of time in China. So a true point about Herbert Hoover, I believe, is the only American president in history that I know of that he and his wife spoke fluent Chinese. As a matter of fact, many times Herbert Hoover, when they were having dinner, he and his wife in the White House, and they didn't want anybody to overhear the conversation, they would both go and start speaking Chinese. I think that's just a really cool story. All right, here's what I'd like you guys to do. I'd like you to now skip a full page, and I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. I want you to date your notes again one more time. It is, of course, November 8th, 2021. It's Monday. I'm not going to finish all the accomplishments today. Let's just see how many I can get through with you guys, and then we'll finish it up on my next Zoomcast. So let's talk about what Herbert Hoover did as President of the United States of America. So please write this down. So as President of the United States, boy, did people have high hopes for Herbert Hoover. I mean, when you look at his background, again, a successful businessman, geologist, multimillionaire by the time he's 40. And again, self-made, he did it all on his own. Born again, poor, as a poor farming family in Iowa, orphaned at the age of 9, goes out to live with relatives in Oregon. Food administrator, phenomenal job. We'll talk about that with World War I. Very successful Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge, helped promote the fiscal policy that made the United States so affluent and wealthy during the Roaring 20s. So everybody thought he was going to do a phenomenal job. It was just going to be a continuation of what had started when Warren G. Harding was president, at least the fiscal policy, not the political scandals. So I want to talk about some of the significant things that Herbert Hoover did. And as we're going to find out, his presidency was a disappointing one. All right, number one. So one thing that Herbert Hoover is remembered for as president of the United States of America is there's an old saying we have, and it's from the great, he's a baseball player from the 20th century. His name is Yogi Berra. And Yogi was kind of a philosopher, and we used to call it Yogiisms. And Yogi used to say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Think about that. And I think that's kind of the mantra that President Hoover is going to take on. So he's looking at the fiscal policy. How much money the federal government takes in, how much money does the government spend? And he's saying it's working fine. Stock market has been phenomenal. People are buying things at an accelerated rate. So let's just continue the policies of the Coolidge Prosperity, which in many ways, you could even go back to the presidency of Warren G. Harding. So I go back to the very famous quote of Calvin Coolidge. Please write this down. The business of America is business. That was the mindset that Harding had. That was the mindset President Coolidge had, and that's going to be the mindset that current President Hoover is going to maintain as well. So what does that mean? So number one, alligator arms. These three Republican presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and now Hoover, are not going to be progressive in terms of getting involved with big business, not like Theodore Roosevelt or William Howard Taft or Woodrow Wilson. They're going to cut back on the federal government's regulation of big business, regulations that have been put into place by former progressive presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and especially Woodrow Wilson. Again, alligator arms, stay out of big business's affairs. Number two, another thing that President Hoover is going to do, he is going to keep on some of the cabinet members of the earlier Republican presidents of the Roaring 20s of Mr. Harding and Mr. Coolidge. And a good example of this is Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of Treasury under three American presidents. He said, again, nobody's ever done this before or since. He was Secretary of the Treasury under President Harding, under President Coolidge, and now Hoover. And remember, it was Andrew Mellon who came up with a very important part of the fiscal policy of all three of these Republican presidents, and that's called Trickle-Down Economics. And again, if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, take a good look at this photograph. You're going to be seeing him on your next assessment. That's Andrew Mellon. Trickle-down economics, draw a line off to the side. Add this as a side note. It's the idea that you cut taxes for the super wealthy. They then take that extra money, they reinvest it in their business because they want to make more money. Maybe they hire more people. They give their workers more money because they're going to work harder. Maybe expand their business. And then in theory, that money is going to trickle down to the middle class. They're making more money. They're buying more goods. And remember, every time you buy something, you're creating a job for somebody else. Somebody had to make it. Somebody had to package it. Somebody had to transport it. Somebody had to sell it. And that would trickle down eventually to the lower class as well. Number two, second major accomplishment of Herbert Clark Hoover's presidency is something called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act in 1930. So what exactly was the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act? So a couple of things. Number one, I know I introduced this to you through a previous assignment. However, I want to dovetail back to it because I think it's really important. This is from Notebook Guide number 30, your key content terms. All right, so the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act was proposed by two individuals. Number one of the individuals is this gentleman right here. His name is Willis C. Hawley. Willis C. Hawley was the House of Representatives chairperson of the Ways and Means Committee. By the way, you might want to add a little side note here. It is considered to be the most important committee in the House of Representatives because it controls all appropriation bills. Appropriation bills means money bills. All money bills have to start in the House of Representatives, and it has to start with the House Ways and Means Committee. So that makes Congressman Hawley a very powerful individual. Number two, now the other key player is this gentleman. His name is Reed Smoot. Reed Smoot was his senatorial counterpart. So Reed Smoot was the chairperson of the Senate Finance Committee. So all appropriations bills have to start in the House of Representatives. You start in the House Ways and Means Committee, then it goes to the House of Reps as a whole, then it goes to the Senate. It starts out with the Senate Finance Committee, goes to the Senate as a whole, and eventually it's going to meander its way to the president's desk, where he's either going to sign it, veto it, or just let it sit. And if you let it sit, I believe it's 10 days, if my memory serves me correctly, at that point, then that bill becomes law. So these are two very powerful individuals. All right, so what did it do? So what the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act did, it looked great on paper. What it did was it raised taxes or tariffs on imported goods, goods coming into the country by 42%. So if you wanted to buy a Mercedes-Benz car, automobile from Germany, great. But you're going to also pay an additional 42% on whatever it is you already paid on that automobile. So what was the purpose behind the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act? It's really simple. The purpose was what America, or let me rephrase that, what President Hoover wanted to do was he wanted to get the American people to start once again buying American goods. Because even by 1930, it's becoming noticeable. Remember, the stock market had crashed in 1929. Remember, there was way too much overproduction of goods and people were cutting back. So the thought process was eventually you are going to need to buy a new car, and let's buy an American car because it'll be cheaper because you're not paying that 42% tax on it. So that Chevy or that Cadillac as compared to that Mercedes-Benz. Here's the thing I'd like you to write down. So the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act is what we call a protective tariff. A protective tariff means a tax on goods coming into this country, and it was meant to protect American industry, to get the American people, the American consumer, to buy American goods. All right, let's wrap this up. So what was the outcome of the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act in 1930? Now remember, this is a year after the Great Depression had technically started. Great Depression started in 1929 when the stock market crashed, first on Black Thursday and then on Black Tuesday. So this was an attempt by President Hoover to right the economy. He didn't think the Great Depression would become as bad as it obviously did, and he thought that the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act would really help stimulate the economy and get America's economy back on track again. So what's the outcome? Number one, well, first of all, leading economists in this country, people who understand economics, basically warned President Hoover to veto this bill. They basically said, Mr. President, this is not a good idea. That in actuality, they warned President Hoover that slapping a 42% tax on goods coming into this country would make the Great Depression, and it's pretty bad already, and it's going to get even worse in the next year or two, even worse than it already was. President Hoover felt very strongly that no, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act is exactly the right medicine to help what was ailing the United States economy. Number two, this is why the economists warned him not to sign the bill. So I would draw an arrow, connect 1 to 2, they go together. So leading economists warned President Hoover, if you slap a 42% tax on goods coming into this country, what you're going to do is you're going to see retaliation. So for example, Germany, they're going to be really angry the fact that now they want to export their automobiles, their Mercedes-Benz here, and they have to pay a 42% tax on it. Well, guess what's going to happen when Henry Ford wants to export Model T Fords to Germany? They're going to do the same thing. They're going to slap a 42% tax on his automobile. So what you see is this, basically what you've done is created bitterness and retaliation. It's a trade war. I tax you, you tax me. I tax you, you tax me. And in the meantime, the money is going up in terms of the taxes, and people are not buying because it's just too doggone expensive. It was simply not a very good idea. And number three, here's the other reason why Hawley-Smoot was bad. Remember, one of the factors of the Great Depression was overproduction. American companies like the Ford Motor Company were producing too many goods. And remember, underconsumption means there's not enough people to buy it. So now because of the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, like the Ford Motor Company are saying, hey, let's crank up manufacturing because we know Americans are going to be buying cars again. No, they're not. Because how can you buy a car if you've lost all of your life savings because your bank closed down, or you invested all your money to the stock market and the stock market collapsed, and number three, you lost your job. So now you've got all these cars still sitting there. So ladies and gentlemen, at this point, we're going to wrap up my Zoomcast for today. So number one, take your correctable tape, clean up anything you crossed out or traced over. Remember, this is supposed to be a portfolio of your absolute best efforts. Two, I need multiple highlighters. Some of you are still using one. I want you to start using different colors, like use one color for your guide questions. Herbert Hoover's elected. Use a different color for your note taking. It's again a strategy, developing a skill that's going to allow you greater mastery and understanding the information. Three, remember to go through and review your ISN the 10 to 15 minutes every day. Remember, you don't complain about practicing for a sport every day, baseball, soccer, hockey, swimming, cricket. Why aren't you practicing for school every day? It's no different. And number four, Remember, if you have the opportunity, the best, most natural way to study is to hand somebody a copy of your ISN. You teach them the information we covered today. Talk about by the numbers of the banking system. How many banks had closed by 1933? What's the percentage of banks that had closed? Talk about the election in 1928. Who were the two candidates, Al Smith and Herbert Hoover? What did they campaign on? Why were the American people, why was it such an issue that Al Smith was again raised Roman Catholic? What was the outcome? What were some of the interesting facts about Herbert Hoover? What do we mean by he was a Horatio Alger story? Explain that. Talk about, for example, how he carried on the Coolidge Prosperity, the business of America's business. And what was the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act in 1930 and why in the long run, it was not a good idea. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed today's Zoomcast as much as you know I love making these. And as I always like to say, as I wrap up a Zoomcast, you know, the story may have ended today, but you know the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you. And as always, be well.